welcome to this week's edition of World Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley in Washington, D.C. It's February 8th, 2013. We had a little technical problem with the show last week. This time we're hoping to have everything go well. We want to keep up to date on many stories. You can do it all at tarpley.net. And in terms of the immediate minute-to-minute, hour-by-hour stuff, especially when the crisis hits or the crises hit, there you want to go to Webster G. Tarpley Twitter feed. Now, we're focused on economics. We're looking at the imminence of the sequester. The sequester is a piece of insanity. Roll back the sequester. Cancel it. Call it off. Forget it. Don't cut the Pentagon, not that way anyhow, and don't cut the NIH, the National Institutes for Health. Don't cut life-giving research. Don't cut the child nutrition program, women, infants, children. Don't cut Head Start. Don't cut a whole series of domestic discretionary programs. This cannot be done with this meat axe lunatic approach. We're still dealing here with the fruits of the Satan sandwich. This is lunatic reactionary Republicans, fascistoid Republicans, and the coward and Wall Street tool Obama, eager to make concessions to them because it fits with his underlying and somewhat occult secret agenda. So we're calling for the sequester to be called off, and I think the Progressive Caucus of the Democrats, Representative Shankowski and Ellison and a couple of others, are also calling for the same thing. We don't need killer cuts. We don't need genocidal austerity. And as everybody knows, these cuts will never balance a budget. They will never reduce a deficit. In a depression, you cut government spending. You're lowering the general level of economic activity. As some would say, you're putting the Keynesian multiplier into reverse. Every 2 government employees that you fire means that you're killing 1 or 2 jobs in the private sector, despite what these primitive caveman troglodyte Republicans will tell you. They'll tell you that if you cut the government sector, you're increasing the public sector, the private sector. It doesn't work that way. So no sequester. And that is coming now on March 1st. That's going to be a hell of a how do you do on March 1st. So it's time to say no to that, right? We're the united front against austerity. Austerity means cuts. We're against cuts. In the present situation, cuts are a Nuremberg crime. How can you cut women, infants, children? A little bit of cheese, a little bit of eggs, some cold cuts, maybe some cheap cuts of meat for expectant mothers, nursing mothers, and various kinds of infant formula and so forth. And that you want to cut? You must be a fascist Republican if you want to cut that. What is building now, I think, is the idea that the Republicans are a hated minority. They're a hated and despised group of people who do distinguish themselves by cruelty and inhumanity and greed and just pure virulent stupidity. But now the question, how do we get out of the current depression? Now we're putting special emphasis on Professor Paul Krugman of Princeton. And last week, you'll recall, we devoted some time to analyzing the program that he laid out in his appearance on C-SPAN a week ago Wednesday. And his method, I think, is becoming clearer, and the need to engage Krugman and indeed the entire economics profession at this point, I would say, is becoming more evident. Let me just premise this by saying what I'm hoping you will do, you, the listeners of this program, you, the people who are aligned or at least interested in the United Front against austerity, when you have the opportunity to intervene on an academic economist or any kind of economist, the government economist, the business economist, a Chamber of Commerce economist and so forth. It's time to get in there. And, of course, we want to refute the obsessive errors and distortions that they have, right? The monetarists and the neoliberals, the supply-siders, the Austrians are worse. The Keynesians also have crippling flaws. We want to get in there and engage in a debate because there is now an urgency in this thing. And this is what I would like to say to Krugman. His latest editorial in the New York Times, his latest op-ed is kick that can. Kick that can. In other words, it's time to continue to kick the can down the road. Now, what he means by that is there should not be budget cuts at the present time. That budget cuts at the present time are highly destructive and will be counterproductive, even in their own terms. But I'm afraid that kind of an op-ed radiates out a certain complacency, a lack of urgency, which, in my humble view, seems to be aligned with the attitude of Obama in his inaugural address. You'll remember on January 21st, actually, Obama's second inaugural had nothing, zero, about job creation, the 30 million unemployed, the need for a recovery program. This had all disappeared. And instead we had the singing tomorrows with global warming and other issues that are far less central to the future and the existential questions, the life chances of people here in the United States and indeed around the world, given the role of the U.S. economy and the exemplary role that the U.S. economy might have. We need a recovery program. We need 30 million jobs, and we need these things fast. We do not have unlimited time. It is a grave mistake to lapse into some kind of complacent view that these things will take care of themselves or that the current programs will muddle through. No. This I think is wrong. So let's just keep up with Krugman. He was on Lawrence O'Donnell on MSNBC this week, and this is mainly devoted to a panegyric of Krugman, that he was right, that the stimulus was too small. Correct, it was too small. That too much of the stimulus was engaged with tax cuts. That's also true. That was Obama already selling out to the Republicans during his first weeks and months in office. But also what's missing in there from Krugman is that rigorous distinction that we're always looking for. What is consumer spending, which is, of course, essential to keep people alive and healthy and able to work, and we're fighting for that every day. But if you want to get out of this predicament, if you want to end the depression, then you've got to address things like capital goods, infrastructure, heavy-duty machinery, turbines, locomotives, drill presses, and things of this nature. Because if you don't restart a process of productive investment in capital goods, it doesn't go anywhere. And the current U.S. economy, with 2/3 to 3/4 consumer spending, that is a sick economy. It's got to, as I say, we're not talking about diminishing the absolute amount of consumer goods. We're talking about vastly increasing the amount of consumer goods, but we're talking about making the capital goods sector grow even faster, because otherwise you're living from hand to mouth. Otherwise you're going to reach a point of breakdown. And the only way to avoid that breakdown, and we've seen this again and again in world history, is to increase your investment in capital goods. Krugman needs to look at that a little bit more carefully. We'll be back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley in Washington, D.C. It's February 8th, and we're keeping up with the questions of economics. The State of the Union address is next week. And as we mentioned, the Obama second inaugural, had zero about job creation, and we're trying to agitate to get something into that State of the Union about job creation and about the Wall Street sales tax. So it's time to make some phone calls, to have some crudely hand-lettered signs. We've shown you how to do that. Get that on TV. Get that on the scoreboard somehow. And let's focus again. The most prominent, the most influential economist in the United States at the present time, the one with the op-ed column in the New York Times and the national soapbox, is Krugman. So again, let's follow the lights and shadows here. And it could be much worse, as we pointed out. He admits there's a depression. He acknowledges the need for a recovery program. That's all to the good. On the other hand, the problems of Keynesianism remain. The inability to distinguish between the capital goods, what we would call constant capital investments, and the consumer goods or variable capital investments. This distinction is not delineated with the necessary clarity. So here's the op-ed from this week. Kick that can. He starts with Boehner saying that the U.S. has been kicking the can down the road for 22 years on spending, the alleged spending problem. No, of course, this is ridiculous. Krugman is right to say, start with a basic point. Slashing government spending destroys jobs and causes the economy to shrink. Absolutely right. It's not a debatable proposition. Even the Republicans admit this, of course. They don't want to cut the Pentagon budget because they're weaponized Keynesians, right? They're Keynesians who believe that defense spending creates jobs, but HHS or the Department of Energy or the Department of Labor, no, those aren't real jobs. So hypocrisy and lies from the Republicans. We're told that the current situation requires cuts. Krugman says no, of course not. The Beltway consensus, the elitists all say it's time for cuts. Krugman, I think, is too optimistic where he says that the United States can currently borrow money at very low interest rates, and that this is destined to last into the foreseeable future. I would not look at it that way. I would stress the ability of cabals of bankers. Let's just take one we know exists. The LIBOR cartel. The cartel that fixed LIBOR, and they fixed it with Barclays and Bank of America. And there's an article up on Tarpley.net lists all the banks that took part in the LIBOR cartel. If they are a cartel that can fix LIBOR, they can also orchestrate an attack on the bonded debt of the United States of America. And their main tools are, first of all, credit default swaps to vastly increase the destructive power of the speculative hot money that they would bring to bear. And secondly, the ratings agencies, the Standard & Poor's, Fitch, and Moody's. Now, thank God this week we've had a first step by the Department of Justice, the bringing of a civil suit against Standard & Poor's. And they're talking about a fine of $5 billion for the malfeasance, nonfeasance, and fraud. That's what it is, fraud by Standard & Poor's in 2007, 2008, when it came to the evaluations that they gave on various kinds of mortgage-backed securities, the collateralized debt obligations, credit default swaps, and so forth. So it's going to be harder to do it with Standard & Poor's, but there are others. I would hope, just parenthetically, I would hope that other states, the federal government, the U.S. states, and foreign countries pile on to the point where Standard & Poor's should be destroyed. They should be pulled apart as if by a school of piranhas. That is what they deserve, because they are an engine of disinformation, and this is what is quite possibly going on before our eyes. We don't want to settle out of court. We want to take that all the way. There are also private individuals, private companies that have been defrauded and damaged by Standard & Poor's and their lying, fraudulent evaluations. Parenthetically also, this vindicates the great Michele Ruggiero, the courageous fighting judge there in Trani, in southern Italy, down there, and practically in the heel of the Italian boot. He has been fighting those agencies, and now he is vindicated. And I think maybe his legal actions will now get a new lease on life, a second wind. So don't let them off the hook. Naturally, this should have been a criminal indictment. It should have been the attempt to inflict jail time on the top leaders of Standard & Poor's. But the parent company, McGraw-Hill, has taken a very significant hit. This is the wages of fraud. So there we go. The Department of Justice is right, and they should prosecute this to the fullest extent of the law. But still, the machine, that doesn't mean that the machine that attacked Greece, that attacked Ireland, Portugal, Spain, is out of action. It's not. And even though it looks today like the United States can borrow money at very low rates, that the entire world is lining up to buy Treasury bonds, it cannot be excluded that collateralized credit default swaps and ratings agencies and other events, which we cannot predict, could be used to attack the bonded debt of the United States. Now, the other thing that I would call to Krugman's attention and others, there is now the beginnings of a little bit of a patter. It's a pitter-patter. It's like the slander aria in Rossini's famous opera, right? The Barber of Seville, La Calunnia. It starts off very, very low-key. Let's take a look at a couple of things. Financial Times, January 22nd, 2013. From Davos 2013, a warning to emerging market investors. Remember 1994. Watch out for the Fed tightening. That's the message from the Institute of International Finance, the Bankers Club, to investors plowing funds into emerging markets. IIF, Institute for International Finance. It's right down there by the IMF and the World Bank. IIF Managing Director Charles Dallara, Dallara, warned that investors have under-anticipated sudden turns in monetary policy in the past and might do so again. Are we adequately risk-aware? I'm not sure that we are, he says, and he looks back to previous examples, 1994 being one of them. I mean, I'm going to follow this a little bit further. There's a patter about a surprise move by the Fed that could undermine one of the basic premises of Krugman. You got to get the Fed under pressure and preempt whatever they're going to do first. And I'll tell you how. Back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. So Krugman says kick the can down the road. I would say don't kid yourself. It's much more dangerous than you think. That same cabal, banking cartel, oligopoly that fixed LIBOR so blatantly, they're capable of all sorts of things. And it looks like we're now getting straws in the wind that they may be preparing something. So this Dallara of the Institute for International Finance, talks about, and they have economists and all this other stuff, the IIF has summarized the events of 1994, the last time the U.S. Federal Reserve tightened monetary policy in a surprise change of course. Now, Bernanke has said that the current 0% or thereabouts rates and plenty of cash, that's going to go on for a couple of years now, but he's capable of surprise. Gotcha. And too bad for you. A surprise meeting done in the dead of night on the weekend, raising the discount rate, raising the federal funds rate, terminating the QE3. Who knows? That's what the IIF and the FT seem to think it's possible. So in 1994, what happened? The results for financial markets were stunning. Far from anticipating a shift in direction from the Fed, market participants had locked into many low-for-long trades. Those began to lose money. chaos resulted. And they give you a little chart here in the IIF. The private capital inflows into Mexico go from about 35 to 40 billion in 93 to 25 billion in 94 to negative 5 to 10 in 95. And that's, of course, a great crisis moment for Mexico. So, hey, do we have anything else about that? Well, gosh, Washington Post of today, the Wonk blog, it's February 8th, 2013. Federal Reserve Governor Jeremy Stein gave a speech yesterday that everybody, or at least everybody in the rather small world of monetary policy obsessives, is talking about. He looked at ways monetary policy can encourage bubbles in financial markets and argued that central banks should be ready to use their control over interest rates to address them. Stein, speaking at the St. Louis Fed, says, I can imagine situations where it might make sense to enlist monetary policy tools in the pursuit of financial stability. Now, cut through all the gobbledygook. It's known that the reactionaries, the libertarians, the extreme right-wingers are naturally, they don't like low interest rates because these disappoint the rentier. The libertarian says, better to throw a few million people out of work than to disappoint one super rich speculator, right? He's got to have a return on his money, right? If you've got a lot of money, you want to get high interest for it, right? So that's their point of view. The argument that they would use in the Federal Reserve and places like this is that there's now a bubble of bonds, that the bond market has seen so much money flowing in that this qualifies as a bubble, and therefore you should pop it by raising the various federal income tax, the federal interest rates. Okay? So those are just a couple of straws in the wind. Now, Krugman would have to factor that in, right, when we have these sort of cartel characters who come forward. Now, here's what Krugman says about the Federal Reserve. He says that in the late 80s and the early 90s, as the Cold War was ending and a lot of budget cuts, especially in defense, went down too, those spending cuts destroyed jobs, especially bad in Southern California with the defense industries. At the national level, however, they were softened by monetary policy. The Federal Reserve cut interest rates more or less in tandem with the spending cuts back then, in the late 80s, early 90s, helping to boost private spending and minimize the overall adverse effect. Well, as he knows and says, if it's close to zero now, you can't really cut that much more. And the straws in the wind are that they're thinking of the opposite. They may be thinking of ways to raise those interest rates because that is the clamor that's coming from the reactionary money bags, including our benighted libertarian characters, right? The people you see wandering around. So here's what I would conclude from all this. Krugman says, nothing terrible will happen if we don't fix everything this year. I don't know that, and I don't want to find out. So here's what I would say. It is imperative to preempt the evil disposition of the Federal Reserve. Don't sit there and think that the Federal Reserve will do nothing or be benign. Watch out for them. They are a tool of Wall Street. Wall Street is a predatory institution. Sometimes it's hard to find the rhyme or reason to what they do except greed and even more basically evil. So what you've got to do is to get the Federal Reserve under control. Now, instead of saying nothing terrible will happen, somebody like Krugman ought to be writing, it is imperative, it's urgent to get control of the Federal Reserve, at least in part, right? It's like Standard & Poor's, right? You can't necessarily wipe them out from one day to the next, but you can at least put them on the defensive and get them somehow you can get your hooks into them so you can control what they're doing. a wise White House, which is what we don't have, a real president, which, again, we don't have until it's proved to the contrary, a real president would be on the phone to Bernanke saying, look, back in 08, 09, you created all of those credit facilities, the term auction facility, TAF, TALF, primary dealer credit facility, money market fund credit facility, on and on and on, a bunch of them. You lent 24, you had a line of credit which was available to be lent to zombie banks for $25, $30 trillion. We need a recovery now. We need 30 million jobs starting now. Let's get moving at least in that direction. So thank you, Federal Reserve. I'm going to have a press conference and thank Chairman Bernanke for his wise acquiescence and his willingness to open up an infrastructure facility with $3 trillion for starters, and, of course, the New York, New Jersey, Connecticut credit facility with another $1 trillion. And all of this can be done without Congress. That is the fundamental pessimism of Krugman in these television interviews, is that nothing can be done. Well, you've got those reactionary Republicans. Well, you've got the fascist Tea Party. That's not good enough. And we cannot allow this malignant force to paralyze the federal government. What kind of stuff is that? Now, Krugman, of course, he is the worthy successor of Keynes in terms of his zingers, right? Keynes was famous for his formulations, right? The economic consequences of the peace. He's got this thing about squeezing Germany until the pips squeak. The economic consequences of Mr. Churchill, that's another funny one. He's got the curse of Midas from things that he wrote after the British defaulted on gold payment in September 1931. He's quite a phrase maker. But, again, this is not going to be adequate. And kicking the can down the road, as clever and witty and sparkling as that is, it's not right. It's not a good policy, because that means that you're vulnerable to any unpredicted turn in the situation. So there will be a open letter about this. By the time you hear this broadcast, it ought to be posted at tarpley.net. We'll be back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Therefore, the word is we need a recovery program, and we need it now. And there are 30 million unemployed that can't wait. And we can't kick the can down the road. And we can't wait for the 2014 election and the hope, which is it may not be a strong hope, that the Democrats, with all their problems, will be able to seize control of the House, because you can't trust Obama to begin with. So you might as well fight for the full program right now and then let the chips fall where they may. Krugman argues nothing terrible will happen if we don't fix everything this year. Sorry, you don't know that. Let's just go back to the last Depression. The last Depression began in 1929. 8 years later, there was the infamous recession of 1937, and part of this was generated by Henry Morgenthau, right? Henry the Morgue, as he was known, convinced Roosevelt that the Depression was over and it was time to move towards a balanced budget. And a question of timing, Morgenthau always on the wrong side of this issue and so many others. On the other hand, that was Wall Street's man, and the idea that a president is all-powerful and can have whoever he wants is not accurate. So the 1937 recession coming 8 years in, and now here we are in 2013. So we're, 4 to 5 years into the Depression. This may now come in the near future. In 1937, the downturn was caused by a capital strike, and we have something similar today. The capital strike was the refusal of pro-fascist big business to invest and create jobs for political reasons. They didn't want to strengthen Roosevelt by getting the unemployment rate down. They wanted the unemployment rate up. They had tried to defeat Roosevelt in 1936 using normal political means, Landa Knox, that failed. That was a debacle. So they said, look, we've got to do something even more essential to sabotage the United States in the face of, the growing fascist threat. That was also something good, they thought, right, to tip the balance in favor of their reactionary policies. So, according to Harold Ickes, the old curmudgeon Secretary of the Interior, and according to Robert Jackson, at that time in the Justice Department, these plutocrats said, we're going to stop investing. We're going to deliberately hoard cash with the hopes of weakening Roosevelt, maybe taking over the Congress in 1938, and then finally stopping him, getting him out. Of course, they didn't expect a third term. They wanted to rule that out. Jackson, of course, had so much experience with homegrown American fascists that he was well suited for his role at the Nuremberg trials, right? And if we'd ever had the second round of Nuremberg, the economic crimes, in addition to the government crimes and the Nazi Party crimes, this would have been Jackson once again. So you get the idea. Nothing terrible will happen if we don't fix everything this year. I hope that doesn't go down as famous last words. Anyway, the thing that is necessary is to build awareness among economists, among politicians, that a recovery is yours for the asking anytime you want it. And you've simply got to get your guts together, man up, put that call through to Bernanke. This can be done by a president. It could be done by a secretary of the Treasury. It could be done by a cabal of senators and congressmen. It can be done, certainly a lot of it could be done by an association of economists. I'm amazed that there's not a group of economists out there demanding what we might call the Lautenbach-Voitinsky solution. Voitinsky, of course, perfectly respectable U.S. economist at the end of his life with the 20th Century Fund. W.S. Voitinsky, that program which they proposed in 1931. Suppose you go back to the meeting of the Friedrich List Society in Berlin in September 1931, or the meeting of the German Trade Union Federation, which we have some idea what went on in that meeting, the infamous role of Hilferding in particular. The people who took part in that meeting really didn't know, those meetings, they didn't know that within 1.5 to 2 years, Hitler would be seizing power. They didn't know that. They were probably telling themselves nothing terrible will happen if we don't fix everything in 1931 or 1932. But then 1933 held some surprises. Now, United States is not comparable to this necessarily, but the minefields are all around us. The credit default swaps are still there. The LIBOR cartel is still there. The plutocrats are in a capital strike. I don't think there's any doubt. We're told that $2 trillion are being hoarded. We ought to have an undistributed profits tax to coax that out. We ought to have another tax about withholding money overseas. The one positive thing, just to move away from this, and is the Standard & Poor's, right? The idea that Standard & Poor's is finally called to account. Maybe criminal prosecutions can derive from cover-ups as they are discovered. Remember, what gets you is not the crime, it's the cover-up. And maybe that will apply to Standard & Poor's too, and maybe that can be exposed in the course of a trial. But there's got to be a trial. Holder and the rest of those people must be put on notice. No settling out of court, no softness. We just had the departure of this guy, Lanny Breuer, a real sad story at the Department of Justice. He was a top prosecutor under Holder now and others, long career. He's asked, how come nobody in Wall Street, nobody went to jail for the world derivatives panic of 2007, 2008? And he said, I was having nightmares. I was asleep. I was awake at night, worrying that I couldn't dare do this, because if I indicted a big bank and the executives of a big bank, then there would be a world panic and everything would come crashing down. All right, that's known as too big to fail. And we actually have a reactionary cabal. We have this guy Fisher from the Dallas Federal Reserve who calls attention to the fact that less than 0.5% of the banks, I think it's something like 0.2% of the U.S. banks have 69% of the so-called assets, meaning derivatives in most cases. But there it is, right? So there is a movement, left and right, maybe more right than left, I don't know. But there is some sentiment to break up the too big to fail banks. The statistic that 0.2% of the banks have 69% of the so-called assets, that's a prima facie argument to break them up under Sherman antitrust and Clayton antitrust. That's clear. Apply the antitrust laws if you can't apply anything else. But even that is rendered inoperative by this awful too big to fail situation. All right. We are still under the spin-offs of the Satan sandwich, and one of them, which we'll be talking about increasingly, the United States Postal Service has got to be saved, and this is a simple thing. And what you're seeing is a brainwash campaign. When you read editorials in the Washington Post and similar rags about the United States Postal Service and how, oh my gosh, the internet has done them in, it's nothing like that. It's called Hastert the Bastard and His Poison Pill of 2006, which was simply this. The reactionary Republicans, these lunatics, these saboteurs and wreckers of the United States, right? This fifth column of alien and destructive influence, they want to privatize the Postal Service. So what they said was the Postal Service will have to pay 75 years of retiree benefits, pensions, and medical benefits in 10 years. So instead of paying 1 year at a time, every year the Postal Service has got to pay 7.5 future years, and ultimately they want that pot of money to be there for a raider when the thing is broken up and privatized. Stop it. No. And we'll be back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome to the second hour of World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley in Washington, D.C. It's February 8th, 2013. So the United States Postal Service must be saved. Time to tell Obama, you want to have a State of the Union address, you better say something about rolling back the poison pill left behind by Hastert the Bastard, because that is the sole, the only, the unique cause of this situation. And any Democratic Party demagogue that does not commit to the immediate rollback, the abrogation, the cancellation, repeal of the Hastert the Bastard amendment that forces, it's an unbelievable piece of sabotage. The Postal Service has to pay 7.5 years of future costs. They're paying until almost the end of the 21st century. The goal is to bankrupt them today, and then to have that pot of money sitting there so that some corsair, some Republican thief and robber and pirate can come in and loot the public treasury by way of the U.S. Postal Service. The U.S. Postal Service is anchored in the Constitution. Hey, libertarians, hey, gun fetishists out there, you're so worked up about your rights. One of the rights, and I'm calling for you to defend it politically, needless to say, is to have a postal service. If you don't have a postal service, that's a death sentence for rural America and the small-town economy. It's also a death sentence for many people who need to get prescriptions and other things through the mail, has been cited, and it's a slippery slope. Once you go from 6 days to 5 days, this is all wrong. The Postal Service has been experimenting with same-day delivery. The problem that you run into is the Beltway elitists. Let's take NPR this morning. Katty Kay of the BBC, a rich foreign elitist, a British aristocrat, says she's glad that the Saturday delivery is called off, because that means that so many pieces of junk mail won't come to her house, and I'm sure she's contemplating all the wonderful trees that will survive. And then Ruth Marcus, the austerity ghoul correspondent for the Washington Post, agrees, oh, yes. And then she says, even though she's been watching Downton Abbey, and in Downton Abbey they have several mail deliveries per day, because that used to be possible. She says, well, that's all in the past, right? Time to come into the 21st century, and that means no U.S. Postal Service. This is a criminal piece of lying. If Obama wants a heritage, a legacy, he's going to claim that he saved General Motors, the largest private sector industrial company, at least by some measures. The United States Postal Service is the biggest enterprise in the world, the biggest company in the world, and they have already cut 200,000 jobs and 200 postal centers. This has to stop. This has got to be rolled back. The privatization and the looting of this has got to be blocked. So we'll be watching Obama and the Democrats, the Wall Street sellout trader Democrats, what they're going to do in this case. And also, if you've ever had to mail things in Europe and similar places, you'll see the prices of the U.S. Postal Service are excellent. They're one of the most reasonable prices for a piece of first-class mail anywhere in the world. So we want this kept. And once again, we're still in this spin-off of the Satan sandwich, because the reason that the current Postmaster General felt that he could abolish the Saturday delivery is that he's now in a kind of limbo as a result of sequester and some other things that he feels that he's liberated and can go ahead and carry out austerity measures. By the way, this Postmaster General, don't trust him for 1 second. He may be somebody who's looking for the revolving door, right? When the Postal Service is gone, he'll be hired by FedEx or something like this, UPS. So don't trust him for 1 second. We'll be looking for the unions to mobilize. And, of course, this is one area where you have rural congressmen, even reactionary Republicans, southern, rural, small town, have got to fight on this one, because this is the lifeblood economically of all of those places. So if you're interested in small town, rural America, you better fight for the United States Postal Service, right? Benjamin Franklin created it. Don't let Hastert the bastard, Obama, Boehner, and these modern degenerates pull this down. Now, let's look at the Middle East. Egypt, first of all, we are indignant here about this fatwa. There is a so-called fatwa. In other words, it's a do-it-yourself death sentence from some clique of extremists, but it is a fatwa issued by this group, right? And it targets 2 leaders of the National Salvation Front. Now, the National Salvation Front is the, by and large, secular opposition to Morsi. So this is not the army and not the Muslim Brotherhood, the Ikhwan, but the National Salvation Front. And the 3 people there that you've seen are, first of all, Hamdin Sabahi, the moderate leftist, Nasserist, anti-imperialist, pro-development figure that we support here. Hamdin Sabahi is our guy in this constellation. You've also got the internationally known Mohammed al-Baradei from the International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna, too close to the imperialists, I'm afraid. And then you've got Amr Moussa, who had been the head of the Arab League. Now, the 2 people that are threatened with death, and this is where we raise our voice in protest. We've got the threat goes to al-Baradei, but it goes to Hamdin Sabahi. Remember, Hamdin Sabahi came in 3rd in the presidential election campaign. This is by far, Sabahi, the best deal for Egypt at the present time. And we got the fatwa has been issued by Mahmoud Shaban, and he says that Baradei and Sabahi have been setting Egypt on fire to gain power. The verdict against them under God's law is death. No, sorry, that cannot be allowed to stand. So we want to express our solidarity with Hamdin Sabahi and invite everybody to realize this is what's going on. Notice that the U.S. coverage does not mention Sabahi. They might mention Baradei because they think you know who Baradei is, and Baradei poses no threat to Western interests. But when you get to Hamdin Sabahi, that is a Nasserist, that is an actual anti-imperialist. And once again, worth stressing, the background of the current crisis is overwhelmingly that Morsi sold out to the International Monetary Fund at the end of November. He doubled the price of gasoline. He increased the sales tax. He set the stage for a value-added tax, which would be even more oppressive. Remember, this is a cynical candidate who ran on the Muslim Brotherhood program, which was to fight corruption and raise the standard of living for the poorest, for the fellaheen, the peasants, and the workers of Egypt. And then he gets into power, turns around and sells out ignominiously to the International Monetary Fund. He accepts their dictation of austerity measures. So, once again, solidarity with Hamdin Sabahi. Sabahi should be president of Egypt. He can lead the country out of the crisis. We'll be back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley in Washington, D.C. Keep up with everything at tarpley.net, tarpley.net. And in terms of hour by hour, minute by minute, it's Webster G. Tarpley Twitter feed. Now, we've covered Egypt, right? Again, strong support for Hamdin Sabahi, has to be protected, should be the president of the country. We hope he will be soon. We also had the visit of Iranian President Ahmadinejad to Egypt, and here we see the excesses of the Muslim Brotherhood. We might as well call it the Saudi Brotherhood, because that's what it is. It's the Saudis. The CIA, of course, has been in a worldwide alliance with the Muslim Brotherhood, but part of it is that that this is something that weakens the countries that it takes over, because it is so oligarchical, right? The Muslim Brotherhood is who? Rich businessmen, rich lawyers, rich doctors. They have this veneer of social solidarity. They have some sort of lady-do-rightly charitable operations, right? In somewhat the way that the British royal family might, right? That kind of thing, right? It's noblesse oblige for the poor, but in terms of where they come down, well, we've seen it. Morsi surrenders the country to the International Monetary Fund and their conditionalities. When Ahmadinejad went to Egypt, he was insulted by these pro-Saudi extremists. Imagine, Ahmadinejad was accused of interfering in Bahrain. So, if you're doing something to help people that are under they're crushed under the heel of that Khalifa family of feudal monarchs there and emirs, that's somehow interference. No, I'm sorry. We can look back, when Egypt was great, Nasser and the Voice of the Arabs was out there constantly attacking the Saudis, especially for their policy of domestic slavery. So now these Sunni extremists, again, I would call them Saudi extremists, have shown what they're really made of. So courageous trip by Ahmadinejad, and remember that in this context, he represents modernization, science, anti-imperialism, and the rest. So he profits very much from the comparison with these people. Plus, Ahmadinejad, say what you will, has not sold out to the IMF in the way that Morsi did. Morsi couldn't wait. He fell all over himself selling out to the IMF. Now, moving on to Tunisia, we regret very much the death of Belaid, a moderate leftist, this time assassinated presumably by extremists, by Salafis, or again we can say by pro-Saudi elements. This is unfortunate. So now we have a pattern from Egypt to Tunisia. And the place to stop that is the defense of Hamdin Sabahi. Let's look at Syria for a minute. Two sides to it. One was that the previous week we had this khatib from the Syrian National Coalition calling for talks with the Assad government. And there's been a rebellion from the Nusra people, the extremists that he has in his coalition. They say, no, they'll never negotiate. And then, when this happened, it occurred to me, if he's asking for negotiations, does it mean that the rebellion is about to collapse? And I don't know still whether the rebellion is about to collapse. So Khatib wants negotiations, and then, interestingly enough, we get the Israelis publicly signaling that they're considering creating a buffer zone inside Syria, that is, on the Syrian side of the border, taking over, in effect, Syrian territory, and that would then be used to shelter the death squads and the NATO forces that apparently aren't doing so well. So I now see two straws in the wind suggesting that the rebellion in Syria may be in real trouble. And we've talked about the reasons why, right? A lot of the jihadis that they could have drawn on have been siphoned off now in the direction of Mali and Algeria. And we've got, defeatism and doubt growing in Turkey, in Jordan, in Saudi Arabia, inside the royal family itself. The question still remains, and after this Israeli blip that the Israelis are considering intervening directly, right? With the Israelis, of course, did intervene with some kind of a bombing of a research facility and or some trucks carrying something, presumably. We don't know that, but these two things together suggest that there is anxiety in NATO circles about the rebels. Can the rebels hang on? Will the rebels collapse? Stressed constantly on the program that the pool of patsies and dupes, fanatics, psychotics, mercenaries, double agents, and all the rest, drug addicts, whatever they are, the people who are willing to go and fight in Syria is a finite pool. And although it draws on a big part of the world, right, from Morocco to Indonesia and from Somalia to Chechnya, eventually, if the Syrian army is killing them at the rate that we seem to see, then, then you get to the bottom of the barrel on that. Now, here's the other thing. Washington Post and others today. The question of arming the Syrian rebels and Obama's reluctance to do this also bears directly on this question. How long can the rebels hold on? We are told in the Washington Post of today that not so long ago, relatively recently, let's see, last year, so sometime in 2012, we had a situation where Panetta and Dempsey, the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, so the Secretary of Defense, Panetta, and Joint Chiefs Chairman Dempsey favored a plan by Petraeus, General David Petraeus, the head of the CIA, the top warmonger, the top Bonapartist, now limogé, right, now kicked out, thank God, before he could pull a coup or do something. Petraeus had a plan to arm the Syrian rebels, like, giving those Stinger missiles to the Mujahideen in Afghanistan and things like this, except this time it'll be turned against you before you know it. So Petraeus comes forward and says, wow, I have a great idea. Let's arm the Syrian rebels. Panetta and Dempsey say, great idea. And Hillary says, great idea. And Obama, according to this report, says no. Isn't that interesting? Is that true? Well, we'll be looking into it. We'll be back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. Since we're talking about Petraeus, of course, let me remind you, if you don't have a copy of Just Too Weird, Bishop Romney and the Mormon Takeover of America with Polygamy, Theocracy, and Subversion, you absolutely need to read that book. You got to have that in your library, because that was part of the faction around Petraeus that seems to have made a grab for power in some way under the cover of the presidential election last year. We're hoping that that various people who traditionally have looked into these things will hopefully look into them. Petraeus had a plan to arm the rebels in Syria. Now, think of the breathtaking lunacy of this, because you're talking right at the Mediterranean, right? You're even close to Israel. You'd think he'd be worried about that, but no. Push ahead. Panetta says yes. Dempsey says yes, and of course Hillary, in her exquisite weakness, she's got to be the biggest warmonger, the most extreme in the room, and that is, of course, weakness. She has to say yes also. All say yes. Obama says no. And apparently it may be Obama joined by Donilon. Now, Donilon, the head of the National Security Council, is widely criticized as a political hack. But in this case, maybe that's just what you need, in the sense that if you're going to have these very serious national security types, right, who don't, they don't care about the sacrifices and what it's going to mean in the inner city or out in Appalachia or the Farm Belt in terms of body bags. You maybe LBJ wished he had a political advisor saying, don't do it, you're going to destroy your presidency. In other words, somebody looking specifically at the political interest of Obama, right? If we can't have a defense of the national interest, well, maybe at least we could have the defense of somebody's personal career interest, right? Maybe that can help us to some extent. And that may be what Donilon provided. What did Brennan say about this? Of course, that's what we'd really like to know. We'll talk about Brennan in a minute, right? The guy who's supposedly going to become head of the CIA. So the U.S. has given $355 million in humanitarian aid. And they have given weapons, of course. We know they've given weapons, but in terms of the game as reflected in the pages of the mainstream press, the Washington Post and the New York Times, officially the U.S. has not given weapons. And they'll say, well, we routed weapons in, but those were paid for by Qatar or the Saudis or somebody else. So that's interesting. And again, if it takes an instinct of personal self-preservation to say no to the warmongers, that's fine. But now think of it. This crew, including Panetta, is supposed to be somebody there to protect Obama and his personal interest, in the same way that Holder is there to protect Obama and his personal interest from being indicted and things like this. If Petraeus is able to carry Panetta and Dempsey, if this is true, and, of course, Hillary, of course, is always going to be, as I say, always for an attack, right? Always for aggression. She lacks that self-preservation because she's so blinded by her need to be tough that she can't realize that sometimes toughness is not to be tough. But you get the idea. So what about that faction? In other words, doesn't that reflect the activity of this warmonger faction, the fact that the neocons had overwhelmingly gone with Romney, that Petraeus is the central figure of the neocon faction these days, and what are these people doing now? And wouldn't that be worthy of some investigation? All right, now, a couple of other themes, since we mentioned Brennan. Brennan, of course, is your typical CIA thug. He has been in the CIA for 25 years. He was the briefer for Clinton. We are paying the price for the failure to impeach Bush and Cheney at the end of their term. We are paying the price for Pelosi's reckless, irresponsible move, saying, I'm taking impeachment off the table. That was a terrible mistake, Pelosi. You share responsibility for these outrageous things that are now going on. We refer, of course, to the drones. We got a reign of terror across the world through the drones. This is generating a harvest of hatred against the United States. The political backlash is undescribable. Let your imagination work for a minute, and you'll see why this must be so. Brennan is Mr. Drone. He is the architect of this depraved, cowardly, illegal, unconstitutional program. And, of course, it's not like any new things were unearthed. Since about June, since David Sanger came out with his book, we've known about the Terror Tuesdays in the White House, where Brennan, Donilon, Obama, and a couple of others sit around a table, and they draw up proscriptions, meaning lists of people you're going to kill. The terror czars come together, they make up their kill list, and the drones are dispatched. American citizens, yes. Awlaki. Well, we know who Awlaki was. He was Awlaki, the CIA lackey. He was a U.S. double agent, but he's still an American citizen. You can't just liquidate him like that. So that's a crime. And his young relative, the 16-year-old kid who was also killed, that's another crime. And we wonder why they were in such a hurry to liquidate their own double agent. That's another interesting thing. Awlaki, of course, had been used to sheep dip Major Hassan of Fort Hood, Mutalab, the Christmas Day bomber, but apparently he had reached the end of his usefulness. This, however, these important considerations retreat into the background for the moment, in the sense that, again, American citizenship got to mean something, and even more broadly, the policy of the drones is absolutely criminal and bankrupt. I would say out of this we get two or three things maybe that ought to be done. The most obvious thing would be that these distinguished senators that we've seen pontificating, we've seen Senator Wyden of Oregon talking about the checks and balances, the wonderful checks and balances. You get the impression that these pompous senators are more concerned about the fact that they weren't told, that they weren't given the memos, that they weren't given the kill lists, that they were not kept up to date on what was happening. They're more concerned about the slight to themselves than about the actual human carnage and the killing of U.S. citizens. And the result of therefore is that they're going to approve Brennan. They're not going to reject him. So I would say the first thing you ought to do, if you take this seriously at all, you would have to say, Brennan, you want to become head of the CIA. You, Brennan, are heavily implicated in waterboarding, and in the course of the hearings, he refused to condemn waterboarding as torture. It is torture. Again, take the way you can test that is, if the other side does it to you, is waterboarding torture? Oh, of course it is. Well, then it's torture both ways. It's torture no matter who does it. So Brennan has that background. Brennan is then the architect of the Terror Tuesdays and the entire drone system, that Obama has killed more people with drones by far than Bush Cheney in his first term. So vote no on Brennan. That would be the first thing to do. A couple of other things to do. We'll specify them in just a moment. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley in Washington, D.C., wrapping up our program for February 8th. The Brennan hearings. If you take the crimes of Brennan seriously, you've got to reject Brennan as head of the CIA. Isn't that somewhat elementary? The second thing that emerges, I think, from these proceedings, it is now time to repeal, to end the 9/11 resolution. That is to say, several days after the 9/11 attacks, the Congress passed a blank check. It's the new Gulf of Tonkin resolution, much worse in many ways. The authorization to use military force, which is the general authority under which all the totalitarian, police state, liberticide measures are taken. The 9/11 resolution, you'll remember out there, you libertarians, the one Ron Paul voted for. Ron Paul was for it. He was for it before he was against it, but unfortunately he was for it when it was a question of getting it enacted, and he supported it at that time. So this is the basis for the whole thing, not just the outside wars, but the internal police state stuff. So reject Brennan, repeal the September 2001 authorization for the use of military force. The other one, the deeper underlying one, is when the CIA fails and fails and fails and kills and kills and kills, isn't it time to break up the CIA? This is what John F. Kennedy wanted to do. He said he wanted to smash the CIA into 1,000 pieces. In preparation for this, he fired Allen Dulles, he fired Bissell, he fired Cable, he fired a whole cabal, and in somewhat the same way that Obama has had to do this. So therefore, isn't it time to contemplate that? Isn't it time for a new church committee, but even more radical than church, since church pulled his punches on a number of points, useful as his role was. Remember that the current Senate Intelligence and House Intelligence Committees, those are byproduct of the Pike and Church Committee hearings of the 1974-75 period, right? And the international assassinations, the Rockefeller Commission on the CIA, leading to an executive order by Gerald Ford that you can't kill foreign heads of state, which I believe is still in force, although Obama can override this anytime he wants to. So those three things: reject Brennan, end the state of war. There was even a little while ago a paper from a former lawyer out of the Pentagon who talked about the fact that it is now time to think about rescinding, ending, repealing that September 2001 authorization to use military force. Iraq has come to an end. Afghanistan will come to an end. Rather than multiply these drones all over Africa, is it not time to end this and to go back to the War Powers Act, at least, which would set some kind of a limit? Now, the remedies proposed by the senators are just laughable. Senator Wyden, his program is, you should be notified. If the government is planning to kill you, they should give you a chance to present your side of the story. In other words, you could say, you've got the wrong man, or not me, it's that other guy, right? Or, there's a million people with the same name. Not very inspiring. Feinstein, creature of the regime par excellence, she wants to have a new special star chamber, right? The star chamber, infamous from British history, is the place where the death sentences were promulgated, right? The proscriptions, but more recently, the FISA court, right? The wiretap court. If you want to get a wiretap, you're supposed to go through the FISA court. They haven't done it much in the past 10 years, but they sometimes do it. Feinstein wants a new special secret court before they can kill U.S. citizens with drones or otherwise abroad. Mikulski, perhaps the most ironic counterpoint to all this, Mikulski said she's had to deal over a quarter century or so with many CIA directors. She actually revealed something that we didn't know, that Tenet had come in with little pipes that he exhibited to the senators to try to illustrate the centrifuges and the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. So she went through how she had been duped, flim-flammed, lied to, deceived, misled by Portergoss, by Tenet, and by a bunch of others, and appeal to Brennan. Mr. Brennan, won't you be more forthcoming? Won't you please tell the truth? Well, that is pathetic. So the other issue, let me direct your attention to tarpley.net. There will be a fairly detailed study of the current immigration debate. And the general guidelines that we have here on immigration, this is a labor market issue. This is a matter of building a U.S. labor force for the 21st century that will allow this country to compete. And I stress, the disposition, the proclivity of people to come to the United States from all parts of the world is a tremendous national advantage. And it allows the United States a crucial trump card, possibly a decisive trump card. We look around the world, far removed from Paul Ehrlich and the population bomb, we find that the real crisis in the world is underpopulation, insufficient people in the workforce, and a declining birth rate. We look at Europe, right, notoriously, Germany, Italy, all kinds of countries in Europe. Europe as a whole, population falling. We look at Russia, same story, population falling. We look at China because of the one child per family policy. We'll see that there's also a demographic problem where the population in China is aging too fast. Japan, the same story, maybe the most extreme, that the population is aging. The United States is in a position to escape that senility, that overall senility of the population, which these other countries are going to have to deal with. And this is just about exclusively thanks to immigration from Latin America, from Asia, from the Middle East, and the rest of the world. We should count this as a blessing. These people have got to be made welcome. My program, in a nutshell, citizenship within 1 year, if possible, 3 years at the very most, no punishment, nothing vindictive. Forget the formal legal side of this thing. It is, if you try to do that, you're engaging actually in selective and vindictive prosecution. It's time to naturalize, to legalize, to normalize, to assimilate. This is the future of your labor force. And the only question is, how fast can you assimilate them, naturalize them? How fast can you give them access to education, health care, and things like a driver's license? What's the point of a driver's license? You want people to know the rules of the road. You want them to take the written test like everybody else, and you want them to take a road test. You want to make sure they actually know how to drive, and at that point, they're welcome to have a driver's license, right? We want this. What possible national interest is served by having the immigrant population denied health care where they can become a vector for epidemics to spread through the rest of the population? No, this is insanity. This is letting this vindictive, racist, xenophobic oppression overtake the obvious question, where's the future of your country? The future is that the immigrant population plays an absolutely critical role. It's 11 million estimated, undocumented. It's 5 million children who are citizens, thanks to our wonderful 14th Amendment, thank God, and probably 2 million possible dreamers who were brought in at very young ages. You got almost 20 million people. It's time for legalization, normalization, naturalization, assimilation, and then you're able to compete with the other economic powers of the 21st century. So that's my approach. Citizenship, and don't give up on citizenship. That's what's going to allow you to break the Republican Party into two parts. The Wall Street guys want more immigration, and the Tea Party racists want none. And in the middle of my policy, raising the minimum wage to $12 and eventually $15. So that's it in a nutshell. Take a look at tarpley.net for all the details, and we'll see you next week. You must be a fascist Republican if you want to cut that. What is building now, I think, is the idea that the Republicans are a hated minority. They're a hated and despised group of people who do distinguish themselves by cruelty and inhumanity and greed and just pure virulent stupidity. But now the question: how do we get out of the current depression? Now we're putting special emphasis on Professor Paul Krugman of Princeton. And last week, you'll recall, we devoted some time to analyzing the program that he laid out in his appearance on C-SPAN a week ago Wednesday. And his method, I think, is becoming clearer, and the need to engage Krugman and indeed the entire economics profession at this point, I would say, is becoming more evident. Let me just premise this by saying what I'm hoping you will do, you, the listeners of this program, you, the people who are aligned or at least interested in the United Front Against Austerity, when you have the opportunity to intervene on an academic economist or any kind of economist, a government economist, a business economist, a chamber of commerce economist, and so forth, it's time to get in there. And, of course, we want to refute the obsessive errors and distortions that they have, right? The monetarists and the neoliberals, the supply-siders, the Austrians are worse, the Keynesians. We need these things fast. We do not have unlimited time. It is a grave mistake to lapse into some kind of complacent view that these things will take care of themselves or that the current programs will muddle through. No. This I think is wrong. So let's just keep up with Krugman. He was on Lawrence O'Donnell on MSNBC this week, and this is mainly devoted to a panegyric of Krugman, that he was right, that the stimulus was too small. Correct, it was too small. That too much of the stimulus was engaged with tax cuts. That's also true. That was Obama already selling out to the Republicans during his first weeks and months in office. But also what's missing in there from Krugman is that rigorous distinction that we're always looking for. What is consumer spending, which is, of course, essential to keep people alive and healthy and able to work, and we're fighting for that every day. But if you want to get out of this predicament, if you want to end the depression, then you've got to address things like capital goods, infrastructure, heavy-duty machinery, turbines, locomotives, drill presses, and things of this nature. Because if you don't restart a process of productive investment in capital goods, it doesn't go anywhere. And the current U.S. economy, with 2/3 to 3/4 consumer spending, that is also have crippling flaws. We want to get in there and engage in a debate because there is now an urgency in this thing. And this is what I would like to say to Krugman. His latest editorial in the New York Times, his latest op-ed is, kick that can. Kick that can. In other words, it's time to continue to kick the can down the road. Now, what he means by that is there should not be budget cuts at the present time. That budget cuts at the present time are highly destructive and will be counterproductive, even in their own terms. But I'm afraid that kind of an op-ed radiates out a certain complacency, a lack of urgency, which, in my humble view, seems to be aligned with the attitude of Obama in his inaugural address. You'll remember on January 21st, actually, Obama's second inaugural had nothing, zero, about job creation, the 30 million unemployed, the need for a recovery program. This had all disappeared, and instead we had the singing tomorrows with global warming and other issues that are far less central to the future and the existential questions the life chances of people here in the United States and indeed around the world, given the role of the U.S. economy and the exemplary role that the U.S. economy might have. We need a recovery program. We need 30 million jobs. And welcome to this week's edition of World Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley in Washington, D.C. It's February 8th, 2013. We had a little technical problem with the show last week. This time we're hoping to have everything go well. We want to keep up to date on many stories. You can do it all at tarpley.net. And in terms of the immediate minute-to-minute, hour-by-hour stuff, especially when the crisis hits or the crises hit, there you want to go to Webster G. Tarpley Twitter feed. Now, we're focused on economics. We're looking at the imminence of the sequester. The sequester is a piece of insanity. Roll back the sequester. Cancel it. Call it off. Forget it. Don't cut the Pentagon. Not that way, anyhow. And don't cut the NIH, the National Institutes for Health. Don't cut life-giving research. Don't cut the child nutrition program, women, infants, children. Don't cut Head Start. Don't cut a whole series of domestic discretionary programs. This cannot be done with this meat axe lunatic approach. We're still dealing here with the fruits of the Satan sandwich. This is lunatic reactionary Republicans, fascistoid Republicans, and the coward and Wall Street tool Obama, eager to make concessions to them because it fits with his underlying and somewhat occult secret agenda. So we're calling for the sequester to be called off. And I think the Progressive Caucus of the Democrats, Representative Shankowski and Ellison and a couple of others, are also calling for the same thing. We don't need killer cuts. We don't need genocidal austerity. And as everybody knows, these cuts will never balance a budget. They will never reduce a deficit. In a depression, you cut government spending. You're lowering the general level of economic activity. As some would say, you're putting the Keynesian multiplier into reverse. Every 2 government employees that you fire means that you're killing 1 or 2 jobs in the private sector, despite what these primitive caveman troglodyte Republicans will tell you. They'll tell you that if you cut the government sector, you're increasing the public sector, the private sector. It doesn't work that way. So no sequester, and that is coming now on March 1st. That's going to be a hell of a how do you do on March 1st. So it's time to say no to that, right? We're the united front against austerity. Austerity means cuts. We're against cuts. In the present situation, cuts are a Nuremberg crime. How can you cut women, infants, children? A little bit of cheese, a little bit of eggs, some cold cuts, maybe some cheap cuts of meat for expectant mothers, nursing mothers, and various kinds of infant formula and so forth. And that you want to cut?